We began this evening with what was to be a long conversation with Senator Edward Kennedy. He has served in the Senate for more than 40 years. People on both sides of the aisles will tell you that he is one of our great senators. He has a remarkable legislative history. He knows and loves the Senate as an institution. He is part of the institution, and he understands what makes it work, that it requires reaching across to people on both sides of the aisle. We didn't get to do that interview today because of interruptions. We look forward to having another conversation with Senator Kennedy at another date. Here is a part of what we did today. Senator Edward Kennedy in conversation at his office in Washington. Do you think where you are on important issues of our day is where the country is, or where you'd like to see the country be?
Where I'd like to see the country be. I believe that the individuals and the nation does best when it's challenged. I think this country has demonstrated it over its history. I mean, look how this nation came out of the Depression. Look how we responded in terms of World War II. Look how we even finally, when we were confronted the issues of segregation by Dr. King and really facing us, even though we'd written slavery into the Constitution and we'd had a Civil War. Finally, when Dr. King confronted us, we responded. We've made important progress in knocking down walls of discrimination. This country's always done well when it's been challenged. I don't feel that it's being challenged. You can't have the tax cuts we've had and be still involved in wars on this and asking a small group of people to take the burden and everybody else enjoy themselves. I think we have to understand now that we're facing a very different challenge, and that is the issue of globalization. And we're either going to get run out of town with the rush towards lower wages and outsourcing, or we're going to embrace it and say we are going to equip every citizen in this nation with the ability to be able to deal with the problems of globalization, and in that way ensure we're going to have the strongest economy in the next 20 and 30 years, and we will have a national security that'll be second to none. And we, I think, are pretty much dead in the water. The administration's policies are catching up with them. That's another issue. But I think just generally speaking, this country does best, individuals do best, and we welcome these challenges. Americans like this, but we're not, that's not part of the whole political discussion at this time, and I think it's both. I think that's where we ought to be as a political party and where we ought to be as individuals.
And it's a role for the leaders of the party to step forward and say, this is where we ought to be. We ought to be challenging America to do better.
That's it. It's not really, that doesn't even have to be a Democratic. It's where Americans would be. And I think intuitively and instinctively, people welcome that. They want to be involved. There's great sense of pride that we see reflected in the personal courage of the Americans who are serving in Iraq, what we saw on 9/11, the extraordinary bravery and courage of individuals. We used to talk about the greatest generation, we still do. That kind of, those kinds of efforts that we saw from people, you know, I don't like to use the word average people, but working families, working people, the personal kind of courage of those men and women, that's out there. People are proud of this country, and they would welcome it, and that's what we're missing.
Do you then believe that those Republicans like George Bush and Karl Rove and others who say we are beginning decades of Republican dominance, you look at the House, look at the Senate, look at the presidential election, are simply wrong? It is because Democrats haven't articulated a vision for the future that has...
Well, it's part the second, and I think we ought to welcome the Republicans want to talk about values. We'll talk about them. What about the value of work? And the giveaways to the wealthiest individuals versus the failure to increase the minimum wage.
So minimum wage and tax cuts and all of that.
What about just sort of truthfulness on single source contracts to Halliburton and not providing body armor to American servicemen in Iraq? I think the whole issues in terms of what's happening to our cities and poverty are moral issues. We could talk about that. But I think beyond that, we need to look at what the central challenge is for us as individuals and for our country. And I think most of us understand, and the great philosophers pointed out, I mean, the great struggle between good and evil, I mean, between challenge and response. Toynbee coined it. It's
right.
The world is challenge and response. And this country has always done better in terms of challenge. And what we're just doing now is just sort of responding to the tides that are coming our way. And I think that it's not what this country really is about. Final point. You know, the Democratic Party has been willing to take on very tough issues. We took on the tough issues, as we should have, in terms of desegregation. But as a result of that, as we know, it was a changed party situation in the South. The Solid South that was Democratic has shifted and changed. Democrats took on the environment. That was a division between the environmentalists and workers, two core constituencies. But because we did, that has changed. We took on the issues of war and peace over a period of time, and that's divided the country. And because of that, we have paid for it in terms of the politics of the time. So a lot of the difficulties and I still have not heard the Republicans from wanting to repeal the Medicare or repeal Social Security or repeal what we have done in terms of higher education, which were basically the efforts that were made by Democrats. But we've paid a political price for that, and rather than retreating from it, we ought to understand that that's really a stamp of pride. But so we ought to be looking for the future now.
What ought to be the debate about Iraq at this time?
Well, I think it's the debate ought to be really how, with the extraordinary success of the elections, which gives the Iraqis the opportunity for them to say, this is our country, which is, it's not an extension of the United States. We're not going to have the United States calling all the shots, setting up the times, the dates, the Constitution, and all the rest, but we are going to do it. And that was enormously important. Now they need the training. They need the training to be able to defend their own country. My own belief is so much of the insurgency is a reflection that the Iraqis feel that our presence there is part of an occupation, not a liberation. And that's explained in a host of different kind of ways, because we never had a plan. We had a plan to win the war but not win the peace. And there's been blunder after blunder after blunder in which we have participated. But in the basic back of the mind of the Iraqis is that here is this all-powerful nation. They can go to the moon and back and win this conflict many miles away in 3 days, and they can't provide electricity, they can't get the sewage out, they can't provide jobs, they can't provide the restoration or the rebuilding of Fallujah. Why don't they do this? Why can't they do this? And I think there's a growing sense that we are part of the occupation. My sense is, with the General Abizaid testifying before the Armed Services Committee, which I'm a member just last week, said they're getting 2,500 Iraqis a day that want to join the new Iraqi army. That's enormously encouraging. We know how to train the best army in the world. My wife has a nephew, had 12 weeks of training. He had a couple of weeks off, went up to Fort Lewis, got his gear, was supposed to have a month in Kuwait, didn't, and is sitting on the back of a Stryker as the heavy machine gunner.
In Iraq?
In Iraq.
In 12 weeks of training, he was prepared to fight.
Prepared to fight, and the best in the world, mind you. And I was just in Massachusetts a couple of days ago and met Joe McDermott, United States Marine Corps, that had 8 weeks of Paris Island, boot camp, 4 weeks at Quantico, 20 days home, went out to Pendleton, had 2 weeks out there in the Vietnam War, flew in a Continental plane to Saigon, and 30 hours later was getting shot at by the Viet Cong. We had the best. The Marines were the best.
So one of the debates ought to be, why aren't we training the Iraqis faster?
Let them do it. Give them 8 months. Give them 12 months. Give them 15 months. But let the Iraqis now defend their own country. Let's let them demonstrate, as they have at the polls, as at the voting, that this is their country. They ought to be willing to defend it. And with that, the United States can see as a goal the phasing out of American military presence and bring them home with honor.
With an exit strategy. Would you suggest 15 months or 2 years or 1 year?
I would say by the end of 2006, we ought to set it as a goal. That is the goal to be set. Now that gives them all the way through the remainder of this year, gives them more